person on the line. So everybody be polite.
Yeah.
All right. Hello!
Hello!
Yay!
Who's the very famous person? I'm excited about this.
You.
It's you.
Oh, okay. How disappointing. Okay.
I mean, we can arrange for somebody else to call in. We can have a call-in while we call in.
Like an actually famous person?
Well, my friend Adam once won $1,000 of trivia, so that's pretty good.
That's pretty interesting. I'm barely internet famous, which isn't even... I guess internet famous is real famous these days.
No, I would say you're real famous. For those of you who don't know who this is, but why don't you introduce yourself and explain why you're actually real famous?
I'm Gary Whitta, and I'm the former editor-in-chief of PC Gamer magazine. I'm a current host of Kind of Funny Games Daily, and I also write movies and television. I co-wrote Rogue One, a Star Wars story. I wrote the Book of Eli behind me on the wall there. Co-wrote After Earth. I've written for Star Wars Rebels and done other things too. So I guess that's enough to get me on Desert Bus. So I'm very excited.
Yay! The joke is that that Gary is actually famous. So thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you for having me. This is great. I've been a big fan of Desert Bus for many years, so to actually be a part of it is a real privilege. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Well, our viewers are also extremely excited, and we have a huge bunch of questions for you. So I'm gonna just jump right in with the first one. Is well, there's some silly questions in here, but this is a good question. I really like it. What franchise have you already planned or written a fan fiction sequel for and are just waiting for the call so you can get it made?
No, I don't know about a sequel, but one of the first things I ever wrote when I was trying to break into the business was a fan fiction, I guess technically you would call it fan fiction, episode of Star Trek Voyager, back when Star Trek Voyager was still on the air. I always wanted to write Star Trek. I haven't had the opportunity yet, but that was one of the first things I ever did when I was trying to get people to notice me. I wrote an episode of Star Trek Voyager that was fun to do, but it was terrible, a terrible episode that I wrote, very bad.
Who did you ship?
Yeah, who did you ship?
I don't think anybody hooked up in that episode. I know it's tempting, but yeah, I don't think anyone hooked up in that episode. The only thing I did do is I refused to write Neelix into the episode. He was just gone for a week.
I mean, that's
because
fine.
I didn't like that character, so I refused to write for him.
That's great. That's great. More people should have done that.
I know, if only.
And we have any other writing questions, so I can sort of keep them grouped by subject. Unfortunately, the questions are sort of coming in live, so I keep refreshing the blog post. Okay. There we are. Dear Mr. Whitta, as someone who is wanting to get into the script writing part of the industry, but living far away from anywhere that TV films are made, how did you sort of like practice your chops? How did you sort of start, getting into that? Do you have any like advice for young writers?
I think it's a little bit easier now than it was when I did it, and there's never really been, and there still isn't really a formal way in. You can certainly go to film school and do that sort of thing. I'm much more kind of autodidactic. I don't do well kind of learning by reading books or being told how to do things. I learn much better by trying and failing, and that didn't work, let's try something else. And so I just wrote lots and lots of scripts. I was able, and this is the part that's a lot easier now. It's way easier to kind of go online and download movie scripts and kind of read them and learn, how movies are written on the page. And it's a very particular kind of language. They don't read like novels or typical stories. They're written in a very, very specific format. And so I got as many screenplays as I could find, and I read them and kind of learned by example. And so that's my one piece of advice that I always give people is if you want to learn how to write movies, don't read books about how to write movies. Just read movie scripts and kind of learn from the pros how they do it.
Interesting. When you were reading all those movie scripts, did you find that there was one sort of like writer's thing that like shortcuts or like tropes that they started doing that you're like, oh, I don't want to put this in my scripts? Like, what do you think? Like, what do you think? Is there a crutch that scriptwriters lean too heavily on? Do you think?
I don't know. I mean, there are certainly different things that you learn not to do. Like, you learn not to write things that can't be shown on the screen. Like, one thing you see in a lot of amateur screenplays is, a character will walk in and they're described on the page, and they'll give you the whole background, like, oh, this person, does this for a living, and they've always dreamed of this or that. Like, none of that can actually, the director would look at that and say, well, how am I supposed to show that? Like, unless the character is saying that or doing something that tells us what that character is all about. It's not something you can just. You have to remember that anything you put on the page has to be able to be translated visually to the screen. And so that's a very common rookie mistake. And the general rule of kind of show don't tell is always, I think, a universally good one. Film and television are visual mediums, and so you always try to prefer to show something by example rather than just have a character say it whenever possible.
Interesting. So, I guess that is good advice, is hey, don't have characters exposit their backgrounds, actually have them demonstrate things. But how... I also write, but I write for our own sketches, so now I'm just picking your brain about writing tips, and I apologize. What is a good way of getting... do you find... what's your shortcuts for characterizing your scripts?
I think a lot about characters before I write them. When I wrote the Book of Eli, I didn't actually think... It sounds like a strange thing to say, I guess, but I didn't really think a lot about the story. And that's just because the story was really, really simple. I had written a lot of screenplays prior to that were very complicated from a plot and story perspective, and they had a lot of moving parts. And that can be really difficult to manage, and you often kind of wind up writing yourself in circles trying to figure out all the logistical complexity of a story. I prefer really simple, straightforward stories because I think the fun part is not in the mechanics of the plot, but in the characters and the emotions and the themes and the stuff that actually kind of stays with you long after you saw the film. So Eli had a really, really simple story that I was able to write in just a few lines on one page. I always knew that the story was very simple, but then I wrote lots and lots and lots in great depth about who I thought the characters were, because I think if you do that work ahead of time, you'll always know kind of who your characters are, and I think a lot about what the movie is actually about, not on a story sense, but kind of thematically what the movie is about. Because I think if you know that and you're passionate about that, and you know that that's there's one particular idea or a central kind of question or something evocative that you want to convey, anytime that you feel like you get stuck in the writing, just remember what it was that you were trying to say. What's the theme? What's the idea that you're trying to express here? And that will always kind of guide you. That's always kind of your true north that will prevent you from getting kind of too lost in the weeds when you're actually working on the story and the plot and the kind of the mechanical stuff that is sometimes less fun to write. Interesting.
So what you're saying is that as long as the characters go on a believable journey that's true to them, it doesn't have to be tons of moving parts. The characters going on a journey that completes their storyline will make people feel fulfilled by the movie.
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, there are certainly plenty of examples of movies that have really kind of intricate, complex plots, like murder mysteries and things like that. For something like that, you have to have a complex plot. And things like Inception, think about Christopher Nolan movies like Memento and Inception, they are very, very deeply layered and complex, kind of on a plot level. And that's really, really satisfying when you see those kind of stories work on the screen. It's like watching, a Swiss watch. Everything is so perfectly crafted, and you really admire just how clever the storytelling is. And I think that's great. I think I actually find that kind of writing really difficult. And what I tend to do is try to write stories that are fairly simple, but have characters and themes that have a lot of depth to them. I think that's just my particular preference and my strength. And so I always look for a simple story well told is what I like to see, and I think what I specialize in trying to write.
Nice. I think you've succeeded so far. Chad is very excited about Book of Eli, but also about Rogue One. Who's your favorite Rogue One character that you wrote?
I like K2. I'm a big fan of K2. K2 existed. John Knoll, who is the genius at Industrial Light and Magic, who came up with the idea for Rogue One and first pitched to Kathy Kennedy. He came up with a lot of the original characters. He created Jyn Erso, he created K2, but they weren't exactly the versions that you see on the screen right now. It's really interesting to see how different writers create different layers to the character as he gets to the screen. So John originally created the idea of K2SO as kind of a rebel logistics droid that was kind of like a C-3PO, but kind of it's a slightly different color scheme and kind of more of a badass. And I then came along and said, here's an idea. What if he was an Imperial droid who had been captured and reprogrammed by the Rebellion? That might give him a really interesting perspective on being in the Rebellion, and when we eventually have to infiltrate an Imperial base, because we know we're going to have to do that later in the movie to steal the plans. That would be really useful to have an Imperial droid because he's going to fit right in. He's already in disguise. And then Chris Weitz and Tony Gilroy, other writers, came along after me and gave him a lot of that kind of acerbic dialogue and brought a lot of comedy to the character. And Alan Tudyk, of course, who played him, brought a lot to the character. There's a guy called Hal Hickel at ILM who animated him and gave him the kind of the moving eyes and a lot of kind of the physical mannerisms that he has. And so it's interesting, the character like K2 isn't created by one person, from the concept level to all the writers that work on him, to the actors and the CG animators that create his physical look. He's got lots and lots of dads. But I just like the fact that I always like the idea that because he was an Imperial droid, I always imagine if you're an Imperial droid, you never really get to talk back to anyone because you'd probably just be deactivated. Now that he's in the rebellion, I think they've kind of taken the restraining bolt off of him. He's allowed to say whatever he wants, and so he's really going to use that privilege. I love the fact that he's kind of a wise ass and always telling people, this is not going to work, we're all going to die, this is stupid, you're stupid. I think droids in Star Wars are always really good at fulfilling that kind of comic relief role, and I'm really proud that K2 has kind of kept on that tradition as great comic relief droid characters in Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that when you mentioned K2, chat was just like, oh, I love K2, and everybody in the room was like, yeah.
He's great, he's the best, how can you not love him? Well, I felt really bad that we had to kill him.
I mean,
spoiler!
Well, hold on 1 second. If you haven't seen Rogue One, this is your warning to turn off the stream now.
I have a general rule of thumb about spoilers. If the movie's been out for a year and you haven't seen it, how much can you really care about spoilers? It's on you if you haven't seen it yet after a year. You deserve all the spoilers.
Gary, yeah, that's my new rule.
Yeah. In fairness, I also warned the chat this was coming like 4 hours ago, so they had time to watch the movie between then and now.
That's true. You had plenty of time to go run it on iTunes or whatever. You could have watched it. So it's your problem.
Nice. This is just for me, how excited were you to watch Rogue One? Because obviously, a lot of people worked on it, and, your script and everything, but how mind-blowing was it to see probably a preview screening? I don't think you had to wait till we saw it to see the movie and say, oh my goodness, I've made a Star Wars.
I did see it before you saw it, but mostly in bits and pieces. I didn't actually see the finished film until the premiere, and neither did many of us, because these things are kept so tightly under wraps. But I sat next to Chris Weitz, who was one of my co-writers on the film, and we watched it just like fanboys. Like, we were sitting there at the screen, just like elbowing each other, like, can you believe this? This is amazing. And so for that moment, you almost kind of forget that you had a hand in making it, and are just enjoying just how amazing it looks at screen. And then when you see your name in the blue letters at the end, across, against that starfield with the John Williams music playing, I remember I really did get choked up. It was so emotional for me as a kid who grew up loving Star Wars movies. And I remember thinking, this is as good as it gets. It's all downhill from here. It was pretty amazing.
Speaking of which, I actually really, really liked Rogue One when I saw it, and I was just like, wow, they're really. What I liked the most about the movie is that it felt like they were like, well, this is not like main Star Wars, so we can do more exciting and more interesting things. We can make it dark. We can make everybody die at the end, right? Did you feel a tremendous sense of responsibility for shepherding the Star Wars universe in sort of a new, edgier direction where it's like, hey, maybe not everybody lives, right?
Yeah, it was a big discussion that we had, and myself and Gareth, the director, have both kind of talked about this in previous interviews. Our initial instinct was to let them die. We thought, well, maybe this is a movie about kind of making the ultimate sacrifice, like these characters die so that the galaxy and the entire Star Wars franchise really can live, because if they don't get those plans off the planet, like Princess Leia, none of that stuff happens. And so we thought, this is a standalone film. There's probably not going to be a sequel to this particular film. We knew that the next standalone would be some other story. So if we want, we can actually, if we feel like it's the right, we didn't think we have to kill him because it's just one movie. Like, we didn't want to be mean about it. But we thought if it's the right choice, there's nothing stopping us from doing it. And so our initial instinct was to do it. I remember in the first draft of the script that I wrote, though, we didn't actually kill everyone. We killed K2, but most of the other characters survived, because I remember thinking, Disney will never let us do this. They'll never let us kill everyone in a Star Wars movie. But in fact, Kathy and Disney and all those guys were completely supportive of it. And so the final version was actually much closer to our original vision, which was that we felt that everyone should make this ultimate sacrifice so that the rest of the galaxy has a fighting chance at freedom. I thought it was kind of a beautiful death that those characters have. They know that it's the end of their story, but again, their story ends so that the rest of the entire Star Wars story can continue.
Cool. That's just neat. All right, we had a lot of Star Wars questions, so I was trying to sort of get through that. Chat was giving me guff for asking too many writing questions. It's like, hey, I have my own interests here, but I have a lot of PUBG questions. Is that okay?
Yes, Gary.
Yes. Unless they're questions about the time that I ran over and killed Kate with my Jeep, that is not. Well, that topic is off the table.
I'm still mad at you.
I know, and some nights I still wake up screaming thinking about it. I will forever be very apologetic about that. And once again, Kate, I'm so sorry.
Actually, Will's in chat right now, and Will and I were talking about that the other night as well.
Will is supposed to be looking after my kid. He's in chat. I have to talk about him. What the hell is going on?
I'm sorry.
There's going to be some conversations after this.
Oh, Desert Bus destroying friendships and doing interviews. How exciting.
Whoops.
Okay, let me see here. I mean, there's a lot of PUBG questions, but here's actually a really good question. Have you ever considered DMing, like a D&D campaign? It's character focused, and this person is like, maybe like a stream thing that you did or like a pre-recorded podcast, because they would love to see and hear what you would come up with for that kind of world.
Yeah, it's really fun. I mean, I kind of feel like when I work, because I do a lot of narrative consultation and story work in video games now, because there's a lot of great storytelling that's happening in the video games medium. So I feel like when I work on those games and I'm trying to factor in not just telling a really interesting story, but also the demands of a game design and player agency, and making sure that the player, as both the player and the audience for the story, feels like they have some agency and they're actually participating in the story and not just watching it passively. That is kind of like being a DM, right? Because you're kind of finding fun ways to torture the player and like, okay, now get out of this. And so when you're working on narrative design for a video game, that is actually, it's a good point. It's a lot like being a DM.
That leads very nicely into another question. What are your hopes as the sort of medium of video games continue to grow and change into the future? Like, how do you want to see video games even get more into, like, not just being, an interactive story, but like, an interactive like experience where you're sort of going along with the characters? How do you think that we could improve video games in that regards?
Well, I'd certainly like to see the story side continue to evolve. I think we've made really great strides. I often say that I think that story in video games, or video games as a storytelling medium, are still kind of in what I would think of as like the silent movie era. Like very, very nascent. We're still trying to kind of figure out the rules, like what's possible in interactive storytelling. When we first started doing this, years and years ago in the advent of CD-ROM, we had these things called interactive movies that really just were like terrible kind of bad films where you could kind of branch the story a little bit. But it wasn't really, they weren't good movies and they weren't good games. They were really neither one thing nor the other. But I think where we are right now, great stuff like The Walking Dead, and there's so much great stuff happening in the indie scene, What Remains of Edith Finch, and amazing games like that, and Everyone's Gone to the Rapture, and even especially on even on the AAA level, we're seeing really Uncharted, we're seeing great storytelling, but I think we're still at the beginning of figuring out like how do you bring the player, not just as a passive audience member, like how do you make them feel like they're really helping to kind of tell the story, and this story is happening to them, and they actually have like a real consequential say in how the story ends, and when they're done they feel like, yeah, that was my story and nobody else's. Like there are some games that kind of get close to that, but I don't think I think we're still a long way from really getting there, and that's why there's a lot of experimentation happening right now. I think we're going to see story design continue to evolve and get more and more interesting. And I'd like to see the end of loot boxes and microtransactions, because I think they're a metastatic cancer that's killing video games right now.
Thank you.
Speaking of video games and writings, is there any video game franchise that you would like to write a screenplay for? And I know that video games have sort of a bad track record with being translated to the screen. At least every Ubisoft video game that's been turned into a movie has not been good. But what do you think there's a lot of potential to see maybe as a video game translated?
The most interesting foundation for a really good film. But we're getting closer again. This is just as with interactive storytelling. I think we're still in the early days of figuring out like how do you take great video game characters and turn them into great movie characters. But I think it's getting better all the time. I do think that the Tomb Raider movie, that I'm hearing a lot of good things about that. I think we'll get there.
Interesting. All right. and I have to completely change topics because I don't want to keep you too long. And chat has a lot of questions about all the amazing stuff behind you. There's the glowy cube that's been slowly mesmerizing people, and people really want to know what that is.
That's the Hypno Cube. I think I got that from ThinkGeek or somewhere like that.
Oh, well, there you go. You can get your own. And then, is that a giant World of Warcraft map behind you?
It is. That's pre-expansion Azeroth. That's that's a vanilla Warcraft map. I mean, it wasn't the version of the film that you saw made, but I actually wrote many years ago the very first film script for the Warcraft movie that I did for Blizzard and Legendary Entertainment, and I became good friends with Chris Metzen, who's no longer at Blizzard, but for the longest time was kind of the creative genius behind Blizzard for many years, and he gave me that map. It was a very very nice present. So there's no any of the Outland or any of the kind of the Northrend or any of the stuff that got added on later. That's just straight up OG Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor, and it's a beautiful map, and it's one of my favorite things in my office.
You have a lot of cool things back there. Is there anything else that's really neat that we can look at?
What do I have? So there's some Rogue One. There's a Rogue One poster there that you can't see. Star Wars Rebels I worked on. There's a couple of really nice prints from Mouse Guard, because I wrote the Mouse Guard movie that is coming out at some point in the future, I hope. There's an original sketch. That's an original signed sketch, the very first concept sketch of Eli pre-Denzel Washington. Can you see my bald? Am I showing you my bald spot here? Because that would be terrible if I'm doing that.
No, we can't see it at all.
There's a big bus. There's kind of a big bus-sized poster of that I got from a bus stop from Book of Eli. There's a poster there for After Earth. There's a little thing that my wife gave me, which is a sound wave of my daughter saying "I love you, Daddy," which is kind of sweet. I've got a picture of a kind of a mock-up that someone gave me of Mark Ruffalo as Lieutenant Columbo, because I've been desperately trying to get Mark Ruffalo to agree to do a Columbo.
Yes.
So I keep that there. I keep that there to remind it that's something I need to keep pestering him to do. He's told me that he wants to do it, but he's just so busy right now. He keeps kicking the can down the road. But one day we'll get to it. One day we'll do it.
Wow. Just to get back to Star Wars Rebels, how fun was it writing Grand Admiral Thrawn? There's a question for it, because that was really fun. I only got to write him a little bit. I think I wrote 2 episodes that he's in, and it was just like one scene in each episode. But it was really fun to sit in the writers' room for Star Wars Rebels with Dave Filoni and many of the talented writers that created that show. And Dave had made the decision that he was looking kind of at the expanded, what's now called the Legends universe, and thinking, what from that. Because there's a lot of good stuff there. It's not canon anymore, but there was a lot of great characters there that people would love to see kind of canonized, I suppose. And Thrawn has always been a big fan favorite, but there was never the kind of the imperative at Lucasfilm has never been like, oh, we've got to do this because the fans really, really want it. It's always like, what's good for the story? What does Star Wars Rebels need at this point in its story evolution? And for season 3 and 4, one of the things that we decided early on was we wanted the Rebels to have to face an Imperial antagonist that was way smarter and way more deadly and dangerous, just like a greater adversary than anything they had faced, to kind of raise the stakes. And somebody said, "My God, what about Thrawn? He would be perfect. It just fits the what we need." And so it was a real thrill to kind of take one of the more popular kind of EU characters and write for him. He's anyone who's seen Rebels, he's a really, really fun character. He's and strangely enough, is played by the brother of Matt. He's played by Lars Mikkelsen, who's the brother of Mads Mikkelsen, who played Galen Erso in Rogue One. So the Mikkelsen family are kind of slowly taking over Star Wars. Yeah. Nice. We are almost out of time for our call because don't want to take you too long, but people do want to know, and it's okay if you don't have a lot of stuff to share. Is there anything that you're working on that we can get excited about in the future that you can talk about? Obviously,
most of it is under NDA. Just the nature of the work that I do is almost all of it's under NDA. And if I even try to say it, this internet connection will mysteriously just go out. I'm sure, like someone will pull a plug somewhere. So I'm sure this is being watched. So God, let me think. No, there's actually not. There's like 3 things that I could tell you right now that be, oh my God, that's so cool, but I can't tell you any of it. I'm sorry, they'd kill me.
Oh, that's fair.
But he told us how many there were.
Yeah, so that's new information.
Just the fact that there's 3 of them is probably more information than you should have.
We can hear the black helicopter circling your house right now.
I'm gonna get swatted live on Twitch by corporate SWAT teams that are gonna come in and take me out.
So you told them about the 3 things, didn't you?
And then my last question, which is just a fun question for me. This is, obviously, you're a connoisseur of movies, you're a connoisseur of video games. You know what you're doing. You're a professional writer. What's your favorite awful movie with the disaster artist coming out and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, so I grew up on it. This is really hard to find. People are going to try and find it after this. I don't know if you can get it anywhere, but there's a British science fiction, a British fantasy film that I grew up in the 1980s called Hawk the Slayer, which is a personal favorite. Nobody's reacted at all, right? Because no one's heard of it. It's a favorite of mine. It has Jack Palance in it, plays the bad guy. It's terrible, but like in the best way possible. If you like kind of it's kind of like Tolkien, but like if they made Lord of the Rings, but like instead of having a budget, they just like everyone in the crew just kind of like chipped in, like it's that. They just kind of had a collection plate, like that's the kind of the version of the movie. People in the chat, people in the chat are getting it. They like Hawk the Slayer. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of fun. I have no idea if you can even find a DVD of it or whatever. I have a copy of it here because it's a favorite of mine. They tried a Kickstarter a couple of years ago to do a sequel of it. It did not work out. But yeah, that's my tip. Go away and if you can find it somewhere, maybe it's on YouTube. I don't know, or maybe you can get like a DVD of it somewhere used. But that's